So the sabbatical, first time in 10 years
Yeah.
that I've taken a break from the podcast. And it's been 4 months roughly of sharing a lot of the greatest hits. And it's been a combination of feeling fantastic. And I've been working on other projects that are really energy in for me. My first new book in the 7 years that I've been working on.
That's not a sabbatical, by the way, but
Well, usually though, in fairness, the word sabbatical is typically used in academic circles.
Oh, Jesus,
and
here
when
we
they
go.
take a break from teaching, they do other things, right? They do other things. And I think you and I, if we're being honest, are both working dogs. Like we can take breaks, but it's like you take a working dog, like a border collie, you stick it in your apartment in New York City and it doesn't run. And you're like, why is it chewing the couch? It's because it has to run. So for me, to do the deep work of books specifically is just a different shift, different gear than feeling the pressure of putting out a podcast once or twice a week.
do you think that idea of shifting between those two, like podcast and then book, podcast, book, if you had to do that, it breaks up your train of thought too much so much so that you wouldn't be able to have the best book that you like? Do you need that undivided time?
You need the undivided time.
Okay, because that
and I'll make a recommendation or something that makes it very clear. There's an essay by Paul Graham, so co-founder of Y Combinator, famous for many different reasons, also a spectacular writer, very good painter also, I believe. But he wrote an essay called The Top Idea in Your Mind, or A Top Idea in Your Mind. And it talks about effectively attention as a currency and the importance of, there's a separate one, maker's schedule versus manager's schedule, something like that. But the importance of uninterrupted blocks of time, particularly if, for instance, you're dealing with a complex project. This is true of coding, for instance, also true of writing, where you're juggling like 27 balls in the air.
Right.
And if you get distracted and you drop 4, you have to start over again. And you have to build that rhythm, and it takes a really long time.
Yeah.
So if I'm thinking about the pressures of, or the prep for, even if I'm having fun, of a podcast, it's basically robbing myself of, let's just call it 20, 30, 40, 50% of the subconscious cycles that I could apply to the book, even when I'm not thinking about it.
Right. I mean, for something like this, obviously we're just bullshitting, but like I'd imagine a typical guest for you on the kind of research and due diligence side is like, is that a couple of days work for you in terms of like
It can be a couple
prep?
of days. In the case of some guests, it can be a few weeks.
Yeah.
If it's way outside of my normal areas of expertise.
Interesting.
And even if we look at a few days, it's a lot of prep. It's a lot of thinking about the interview, even when I'm done prepping, which avenues I might take based on answers that go in a particular direction. So I take the craft of podcasting very seriously, although it's been a chance also for me, and I wanted to take this sabbatical not just to, say, work on the book, but to think about first 10 years have been great. If I continue to do this, which I would like to do, how do I keep it as exciting for me personally as possible? And if I do that, can I differentiate it in a podcast ecosystem that is increasingly oversaturated?
Yes. This is the reason I just stopped doing podcasting.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't stop it, but I cut back to like one episode every 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And it's because when I have a guest on, I totally get what you were saying, because I remember I hit you up. I had a dear friend that launched a new book and you're like, hey, I'm not doing any new books. And when you look at that person, great book, I loved it. They did 10 podcasts, right? And they all talk about the same thing. Right. So then you're just playing the like, okay, maybe I want Tim's version. Maybe I want, whoever else top 10 podcaster out there.
Yeah. You're eating Kung Pao chicken no matter what.
Right.
Like it's just like whose sauce is slightly different.
Exactly. And it doesn't feel as additive to the ecosystem to just do the same thing that's going around on the circuit.
Yeah.
Right?
So let me get your take.
Yeah.
And also for people listening, I would love your take. I mean, I'm doing a lot of reflection on my own, so I'm not just outsourcing this, but in terms of rules for myself moving forward, I've thought about a few things. One is to basically take a barbell approach where I'm interviewing people who effectively no one has ever heard of, right? So who knows? The popcorn king of Milwaukee or whatever, right? Some master who has not ever made the rounds.
Right.
Ideally, it's someone, for instance, who's never done a long form interview, like Jocko Willink the first time he was on the podcast or whatever it might be. Or on the opposite, very far end, it's someone almost everyone would know, right? Like a Bezos or a fill in the blank, right? But very little in between, because the podcasting circuit has largely become 20 or 30 podcasts at a time of book authors doing the modern equivalent of a radio satellite tour.
Right.
And I just don't particularly want to participate in that anymore.
Yeah. But with the Bezos, I'd imagine like you're not going to go like, "Hey, tell me about Q4 of last year at Amazon."
No, I'd want to be like, make it more perennial.
Tell me about like how was your divorce, like, or like shit that like you could get into. Hopefully, that is uniquely that you haven't heard anywhere else.
And I'd want it to be evergreen. Right?
Yeah,
like I don't, I really don't want to, and this is to my economic detriment, right? But I don't want to chase the current controversy of the day. I don't want things that are going to expire in 2 months.
Right.
I want my back catalog to be as interesting to people as the newer episodes.
Yes.
And that's going to mean taking probably a pretty major financial haircut, but I'm totally fine with that at this point, because also you have to think about, say, if you're thinking about the economic side of things, like there's the short term and there's the long term, right? If I get so apathetic or bored that I stop doing the podcast, well, that's the end of the income period. Right. So if I ratchet it back 40%, let's just say in terms of volume, but I do it for longer over time, and my audience can tell that I'm really excited about the episodes that I'm putting out, which I, in general, have been.
Yeah.
Right? There are very few compromises I've made, but I can see the slippery slope of just taking whatever gets pitched to you by publicists for the latest and greatest book.
Yeah.
So these are all considerations.
I love that, man. I think that's a great approach. I'd much rather see the longevity of Tim and higher quality episodes than just banging them out every single week.
Totally. And I don't feel like I've made many compromises, but there have been a few where I'm like, I don't want to do this kind of interview again.
Yeah.
And I've also thought in terms of format of basically doing co-hosted catch-ups with friends. So for instance, I might have, and none of these people have agreed, so I don't want to, well, actually, I'm not even going to mention names, but you can imagine some of my closest friends who have been on the podcast who are very, very smart and good at asking questions. I catch up with them. They suggest a guest they think we could interview together.
That's fun.
And then I'm catching up with a close friend while we're interviewing someone.
That's cool.
I think that would be great. I think that'd be super additive to my life.
Yeah.
And then hopefully that transmits in the same way that I think a large reason, say, the All In podcast has become massively popular is because of that interplay. And it's fun.